they disappeared into thin air. One after another, some of the world's most skilled mountaineers vanished on Everest's deadly slopes, swallowed by ice and wind, leaving behind only questions that have haunted the climbing world for decades. No bodies recovered, no final words, just silence where legends once stood. Mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. Peter Boardman stood at the base of Everest in April 1982, staring up at a route most climbers considered impossible. He wasn't alone. Beside him was Joe Tasker, his climbing partner and closest friend. Together, they had already conquered some of the most challenging peaks in the world, building a reputation as two of the boldest alpinists of their generation. But this was different. The northeast ridge they planned to climb had never been successfully attempted. It was steep, exposed, and so remote that even the greatest climbers dismissed it as too dangerous. This wasn't just another mountain. This was a statement about what was possible when skill met determination. Peter was the thoughtful one, always calm and measured in his approach. He had studied English literature at university and brought a poet's sensitivity to the brutal world of high-altitude climbing. His writings about previous expeditions revealed a man who understood that mountains demanded not just physical strength, but mental clarity and emotional resilience. He could describe the terror and beauty of climbing in ways that made readers feel they were there on the ridge with him. Joe was his opposite in many ways, intense, driven, almost obsessive about pushing boundaries. He had once considered becoming a priest, but found his calling instead among the highest peaks on Earth. Where Peter was reflective, Joe was fierce. Yet somehow they balanced each other perfectly, each compensating for what the other lacked. By 1982, their partnership had become legendary in climbing circles around the world. They didn't climb like others did. No massive support teams hauling gear up the mountain. No supplemental oxygen to make breathing easier. No safety nets or backup plans. Just two men, moving fast and light through terrain that could kill them in an instant. They trusted each other completely, with their lives and their dreams, and that trust had carried them through climbs that others thought were suicidal. They had tackled difficult routes in the Alps, pushed themselves on expeditions to the Himalayas, and each time they returned, having done something remarkable. But the northeast ridge of Everest was going to test them in ways they had never experienced before. The route they chose twisted along Everest's Tibetan side, a jagged spine of rock and ice that stretched toward the sky like a dragon's back. Most climbers avoided it entirely, choosing established routes with known hazards and escape options. The few who had studied the northeast ridge called it a death trap. Too technical, too exposed, too unpredictable. The terrain was a nightmare of loose rock, knife-edge snow ridges, and vertical ice walls. Even Reinhold Messner, perhaps the greatest mountaineer who ever lived, had looked at that ridge and called attempting it a fantasy. But Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker weren't deterred. They believed in themselves and in each other, and they were convinced they could do what no one else had done. They decided on alpine-style climbing, which meant committing fully once they left base camp. No fixed ropes to guide them back down if things went wrong. No camps stocked by Sherpas with food and fuel waiting at intervals. No oxygen bottles to help them breathe in the death zone. Just the two of them carrying everything they needed on their backs, moving as a single self-contained unit through one of the most hostile environments on the planet. It was the purest form of climbing, stripping away all the support systems that made modern Everest expeditions possible. It was also the most dangerous. One mistake, one moment of bad judgment, one equipment failure, and there would be no second chances. No rescue was possible at the altitudes they would be climbing. The conditions were brutal from the moment they arrived at base camp on the Tibetan side of the mountain. The jet stream, That river of air that flows around the earth at high altitude hammered the upper mountain with winds that could knock a man off his feet and send him tumbling down thousands of feet of steep terrain. Snow was deep and unstable, creating constant avalanche danger. The cold was so intense it could freeze exposed skin in seconds, and frostbite was a perpetual threat. But Peter and Joe were patient and methodical. They knew that rushing would only get them killed. They spent weeks acclimatizing, letting their bodies gradually adjust to the thin air. They carried loads up and down the lower slopes, stashing gear at strategic points, preparing their bodies for the final push that would take them into the death zone. Slowly, carefully, they worked their way higher up the mountain, edging closer to their target. The second pinnacle, a jagged tower of rock and ice perched at over 8,200 meters, became their focus. It wasn't just the altitude that made it dangerous, though the thin air alone would kill most people. The terrain was incredibly complicated. Jagged towers of rock that had to be climbed with technical skill, loose stones that could give way underfoot, knife-edge snow ridges where one wrong step meant a fall down either side of the ridge. Every meter gained required intense concentration and effort. At that altitude, even simple tasks became exhausting. Tying a knot or adjusting a crampon could leave them gasping for breath. On May 15th, Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker left their high camp positioned just below 8,000 meters and began climbing toward the second pinnacle. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. All the training, all the preparation, all the years of climbing together came down to this push. They carried minimal gear, just enough to survive a night or two if they had to bivouac on the mountain. No elaborate radio equipment, just a basic walkie-talkie for occasional contact with base camp. No oxygen, no backup plan, no margin for error. At this altitude, in what climbers call the death zone, the air contained only a third of the oxygen found at sea level. Every movement required enormous physical effort. Thinking became sluggish and confused. Decision-making grew harder as the brain struggled to function without adequate oxygen. The body began consuming itself at that altitude, burning muscle tissue for fuel, shutting down non-essential functions to preserve energy for the most critical systems. Climbers in the death zone are literally dying, and the only question is whether they can accomplish their goal and get back down before their bodies give out completely. Peter and Joe knew all this. They had studied high-altitude physiology. They understood the risks, but they believed in their training and their partnership. They believed they could make it. That evening, as the sun began to set and temperatures plummeted even further, a crackling radio transmission reached base camp far below. It was Peter and Joe. Their voices sounded calm, almost casual considering where they were and what they were attempting. They reported good progress toward the second pinnacle. They planned to bivouac near it and push higher the next day. The message was brief and routine, the kind of update climbers make all the time. No one listening had any reason to worry or think anything was wrong. It was the last time anyone would ever hear their voices. 2 days later, on May 17th, team members at base camp trained their binoculars on the ridge high above. Through the powerful lenses, they spotted 2 tiny figures moving slowly across the snow. It had to be them. No one else was on that route. They were far above 8,200 meters, tiny specks of color against the white and gray of rock and ice, inching toward the second pinnacle. Then clouds rolled in thick and fast, and the mountain swallowed them whole. No one ever saw them again. The weather turned savage with frightening speed. Wind shrieked across the ridge with enough force to tear tents apart. Snow fell in blinding curtains that made visibility drop to zero. Temperatures plummeted even further below the already deadly cold, the kind of storm that erases footprints within minutes and punishes anyone caught exposed. At base camp, their teammates waited in agonizing helplessness, scanning the mountain through binoculars during any break in the clouds, hoping desperately for any sign of movement. A flash of color from their clothing, a moving figure making its way down, anything that would indicate they were still alive and descending. But there was nothing. Just wind and snow and a terrible silence that felt wrong. Mounting a rescue at that altitude was impossible. In those conditions, with that weather, no one could survive for long without shelter, food, and warm clothing. Peter and Joe had minimal supplies for bivouacking. If they were injured or trapped, or simply too exhausted to move, they would freeze to death within hours. And the route was so dangerous, so technically difficult, that sending more climbers up would only create more casualties. The rescue team would likely die trying to reach climbers who were probably already dead. After days of agonizing waiting and hoping, the team made the heartbreaking decision to call off any rescue attempts. Back in Britain, the news devastated the mountaineering community and the nation. Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker weren't just excellent climbers. They were beloved figures, known not only for their bold climbing, but for their writing and their vision of what mountaineering could be. Peter had published books about his expeditions that were praised for their literary quality. Joe had written with raw honesty about the psychological demands of extreme climbing. Together, they represented a new generation of alpinists who combined physical prowess with intellectual depth. Their disappearance felt like a tragedy, not just for their families and friends, but for the entire climbing world. The mystery of what happened to them became one of Everest's most haunting puzzles. Had they reached the summit of the second pinnacle only to get trapped on the descent? Did one of them fall, pulling the other down with him since they would have been roped together? Or did they simply run out of strength, their bodies giving out as the altitude and cold slowly shut them down? No one knew, and that uncertainty made the loss even harder to bear. In the climbing world, their disappearance became the kind of story people told in hushed voices late at night, a reminder that even the very best climbers could vanish without a trace on Everest. 10 years passed. Seasons came and went. New expeditions climbed Everest via other routes. The mystery of Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker faded slightly as other tragedies occurred and other stories emerged. Then in 1992, a Japanese expedition was climbing along the northeast ridge when they made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the mountaineering community around the world. They found a body sitting upright in the snow, leaning back against a rock outcropping, as if simply resting and looking at the view. It was Peter Boardman. He was still wearing his distinctive red down suit, frozen, solid, perfectly preserved by the intense cold at that altitude. He was positioned just below the second pinnacle, not far from where he and Joe had last been seen through binoculars a decade earlier. There were no obvious signs of trauma or violence, no evidence of a fall that would have left broken bones or torn clothing. No signs that an avalanche had hit him. It looked like he had simply sat down to rest and never gotten back up. High-altitude death often happens that way, climbers report. The body reaches its absolute limit. Exhaustion becomes overwhelming. The cold seeps deeper, and sitting down to rest feels like the most natural thing in the world. Many climbers describe it as feeling like falling asleep, a gentle fading away rather than a violent end. But Joe Tasker was nowhere to be found, and that deepened the mystery even further. Had they been together when Peter sat down? Did Joe try to continue on, searching for help or attempting to reach the summit to fulfill their dream? Did he fall into a crevasse hidden by snow, one of those deep cracks in the ice that can swallow a person without a trace? Or is his body still up there somewhere, hidden in a place no climber has yet searched, waiting to be discovered by some future expedition? The questions linger even now, more than 40 years after they disappeared. While the climbing world was still processing the tragedies of Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker, another name was being whispered in alpine circles and extreme sports communities. Marco Siffredi grew up in Chamonix, a small French town cradled between the massive peaks of the Alps. The mountains were literally in his backyard, dominating the skyline, calling to him from the moment he could understand what they were. From the time he could walk, Marco was drawn to snow and the steep slopes that made adults nervous just looking at them. While other children his age spent their days playing soccer in parks or riding bikes through town, Marco chased something colder, wilder, and far more dangerous. He became obsessed with snowboarding, but not the kind of snowboarding most people did at comfortable resorts with groomed runs and ski lifts. Marco wanted the steepest faces, the most technical descents, the lines that no one else had ever ridden. He wasn't just talented, he was visionary, able to look at a mountain face and see a route down that others couldn't even imagine. By his teenage years, Marco was already carving down slopes that experienced mountaineers with decades of experience feared to climb. He would study a face for hours, memorizing every feature, planning his line with the precision of a chess master, thinking 20 moves ahead. Then he would drop in and ride it with a combination of technical skill and raw courage that left people watching in stunned silence. He wasn't reckless, despite how his descents looked. He was calculated and intensely focused, with an almost supernatural ability to read snow conditions and terrain. But he was also driven by something deeper than just skill or even passion for the sport. He needed to push boundaries, to do things that had never been done, to leave his mark on mountains in a way that would matter and be remembered. And towering above all his other dreams, visible in his mind even when he closed his eyes, was Mount Everest. In 2001, Marco Siffredi stood on the summit of Everest with his snowboard strapped to his pack. He had climbed for weeks to reach this point, acclimatizing to the altitude, working his way up the mountain step by difficult step. But reaching the top was never his real goal. For Marco, the summit was just the starting point. The dream began on the way down. He planned to ride the Hornbein Couloir, a steep, narrow chute carved by wind and ice down Everest's north face. It wasn't a route most climbers would even consider descending on foot, let alone on a snowboard. The angle was severe, the conditions unpredictable, the consequences of any mistake instantly fatal. But Marco had visualized this descent for years. He had studied photographs and videos. He had trained on similar terrain in the Alps. He felt ready. The conditions weren't perfect that year. There was less snow coverage than he had hoped for, and patches of exposed rock jutted through the snow like teeth waiting to catch an edge and send a rider tumbling. But Marco made the decision to go for it anyway. He had come too far to turn back now. He clipped into his board with hands that were steady despite the altitude and cold. He looked down at the endless face of ice and stone stretching below him, falling away toward the distant valley thousands of meters below. And then he dropped in, committing himself to a descent that would either make history or kill him. The ride wasn't smooth or perfect like the runs he did in videos back home. Reality on Everest was harsh and unforgiving. He had to unstrap multiple times, carefully picking his way across sections of bare rock where riding was impossible. He traversed steep ice sections where one slip would mean a fall of thousands of feet. But none of the difficulties mattered in the larger sense. Despite the challenges and imperfections, he was doing it. For the first time in human history, someone was snowboarding down Mount Everest. When Marco finally reached the bottom, exhausted but alive and exhilarated, he had accomplished something absolutely extraordinary that no one had thought possible. The world of extreme sports and mountaineering was stunned. News of his descent spread rapidly through climbing and snowboarding communities, and then into mainstream media. He had done the impossible. combined two disciplines that most people thought were incompatible. Mountaineers didn't understand snowboarding. Snowboarders didn't understand 8,000-meter peaks. But Marco had brought them together in one incredible achievement. Sponsors came calling immediately. Media outlets wanted interviews and footage. Marco's name became famous far beyond the small world of extreme mountaineering. But deep inside, in the quiet moments when the excitement faded and he was alone with his thoughts, Marco knew he wasn't finished. The Hornbein Couloir had been an incredible achievement. Yes, it had proven that Everest could be snowboarded, but it hadn't been the pure line he had imagined in his dreams. There had been too many sections where he had to unstrap and walk, too much rock exposure, too many compromises between the ideal descent and the reality of conditions. It was a start, a proof of concept, but it wasn't perfection. And Marco was a perfectionist. There was another route, he knew, even steeper, even more dangerous, but cleaner and more direct. The Hornbein Couloir, a narrow, near-vertical chute slicing straight down Everest's deadly north face like a knife cut. Compared to the Hornbein Couloir, the Hornbein was everything Marco wanted. It was cleaner, with better snow coverage typically. It was more direct, a pure fall line from summit to base. It was infinitely more lethal, with greater consequences for any mistake. Very few climbers had even attempted the Hornbein on foot. Those who had described it as one of the most dangerous routes on Everest, steep and exposed with objective hazards like rockfall and avalanches that could kill without warning. For Marco, it represented the ultimate challenge, the perfect line, the purest descent down the highest mountain on Earth. It was what he had really been chasing all along. The Hornbein descent had been practice. The Hornbein would be perfection. He began planning his return to Everest almost immediately after returning from his first successful descent. He envisioned a smaller team this time, more focused and mobile. He chose a riskier season with potentially better snow conditions, but also more unstable weather. Everything was focused on that one perfect line down the Hornbein Couloir. In 2002, just 1 year after making history with his first descent, Marco Siffredi returned to Everest. His mind was completely focused on finishing what he had started, on achieving the perfect snowboard descent he had been dreaming about for years. On August the 24th, he stood once again on the summit of Everest. Around him, the sky was a deep, endless blue. The mountain was eerily quiet, as it sometimes is in those brief moments between storms. But something felt wrong to the people around him. Marco looked exhausted in a way that went beyond normal summit fatigue. The Sherpas who had climbed with him said he seemed drained, weaker than he had been the previous year. The ascent had taken more out of him physically and mentally than anyone had expected. His movements were slower. His responses to questions were delayed. His eyes looked distant. Even worse for the situation, the season was already quite late. The monsoon could arrive at any time, bringing weather that would make the mountain completely impassable. And the snow conditions on the Hornbein Couloir, from what they could observe, were far from ideal. There were wind-loaded sections that could avalanche. There were areas where snow coverage looked thin. Friends and fellow climbers urged Marco to wait, to descend safely via the normal route, and come back another time when conditions were better and he was stronger. They could see he wasn't in peak condition. They worried about what would happen if something went wrong up high, where no rescue was possible. But Marco had come too far, invested too much emotionally and physically to turn back now. He had dreamed about this specific line, this specific descent, for too long. His entire life had been building toward this moment. Everything he had done in snowboarding had been preparation for this. He made his decision. He strapped into his snowboard with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and cold. He gave a final nod to his Sherpa team, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. And then he disappeared over the summit edge, dropping into the Hornbein Couloir. That was the last time anyone saw Marco Siffredi alive. Hours passed with no sign of him, then days. Search parties at base camp scanned the slopes desperately with powerful binoculars, looking for any sign, any glimpse of his distinctive bright clothing or his snowboard glinting in the sun. But the mountain gave back nothing. The Hornbein Couloir remained silent and empty. Nobody appeared on the lower slopes where it would have been visible. No equipment was found. Marco had simply vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The theories about what happened are numerous, but ultimately just speculation. Some believe he lost control on a particularly steep section of ice and was unable to stop himself, accelerating down the couloir until he hit rocks or was buried by an avalanche he triggered. Others think exhaustion simply overwhelmed him somewhere mid-descent, his body giving out, and he sat down, unable to continue, and froze to death quickly in the extreme cold. Some wonder if he fell into a hidden crevasse, one of those deep cracks in the glacier that can be concealed by thin snow bridges that collapse under weight. No one knows with certainty. His body was never found, despite searches in subsequent years. His snowboard, which surely would have been visible on the white snow if it had come loose, was never recovered. Only silence remained from the mountain, and Everest kept its secrets locked away in ice. Marco Siffredi wasn't chasing fame or money or sponsors when he returned to Everest for that second attempt. He already had all of those things after his first successful descent. He was chasing something purer and more personal, a dream of the perfect line, the perfect descent, the achievement that would represent the absolute pinnacle of what he was capable of. He wanted to ride the highest mountain on Earth in a way that was clean and pure and perfect. He made history once with the Norton Couloir, proving it could be done. But it wasn't enough for him. It wasn't the perfection he sought. So he risked everything to chase that perfect dream, and the mountain took everything in return. Today, somewhere high on the Hornbein Couloir, Marco's story ended in a way that no one witnessed. The wind still blows across that steep, narrow chute, and sometimes climbers passing by on other routes wonder if they might spot something, some trace of the young snowboarder who dared to dream bigger than anyone else. But Everest's appetite for mystery and tragedy wasn't satisfied, even after taking Peter, Joe, and Marco. Years earlier, in 1975, another climber had vanished on Everest under circumstances that remain equally baffling to this day. His name was Mick Burke, and unlike the others, whose disappearances happened in remote locations on difficult routes, his vanishing occurred during what should have been a triumphant moment on a well-traveled path. Mick was part of a large British expedition attempting to summit Everest via the southwest face, one of the mountain's most challenging, but by that time, relatively well-known routes. He was an experienced mountaineer who had been to high altitude many times. But he was also a skilled cameraman, and his role on the expedition was dual. He would climb, yes, but he would also document the attempt, capturing footage for what would become a major film about the expedition. Mick Burke was tough and determined, with a stubborn streak that both helped and hindered him on mountains. He had been high on Everest during a previous expedition and understood the mountain's dangers better than most climbers. He knew what the death zone could do to judgment and physical capability. He knew how quickly weather could turn and trap climbers. He knew that small decisions at extreme altitude could mean the difference between life and death. But he also knew opportunity when he saw it. And on September 26, 1975, opportunity was within reach. Mick was climbing with Doug Scott and Dougal Haston, two of Britain's most accomplished high-altitude climbers. The three men were making good progress toward the summit, moving steadily upward despite the thin air and brutal cold. But the day was wearing on longer than planned, and the weather was deteriorating with concerning speed. Clouds were building on the horizon, moving toward the mountain. Wind was picking up, a sign that a storm system was approaching. Temperature was dropping rapidly as afternoon turned toward evening. At around 600 feet below the summit, close enough to see the top clearly, Doug Scott and Dougal Haston made a decision that probably saved their lives. They stopped climbing and turned back. It was a painful choice because they were so close to their goal. But they had been climbing for many hours already. They were exhausted. The weather was clearly turning dangerous. And they knew from experience that pushing higher in failing light and worsening weather conditions would be suicide. The summit simply wasn't worth dying for. But Mick Burke didn't want to turn back. He was so incredibly close enough to almost reach out and touch the summit. And he wanted footage from the very top for the expedition film. It would be the crowning achievement of his work as both climber and cinematographer. The images would be spectacular and historic. Doug and Dougal tried hard to convince him to turn around with them. They argued urgently that the risks were mounting with every passing minute. They pointed out that the weather was clearly deteriorating. They reminded him that they needed to descend, while they still had the strength and visibility to do so safely. They told him that getting film wasn't worth dying for. But Mick was adamant and wouldn't be convinced. His mind was made up. He told them firmly that he would go quickly to the summit, just to the very top to get the footage he needed, and then he would catch up with them on the descent. It wouldn't take long, he insisted. Maybe 30 minutes to the summit, a few minutes for filming. Then he would be racing down behind them. He would be right there, he promised. It was a decision that would haunt everyone who knew him for the rest of their lives. Mick Burke continued climbing higher, while Doug and Dougal began their descent. He disappeared into the mist and snow that was now engulfing the upper reaches of the mountain like a gray blanket. Doug and Dougal descended as quickly as they safely could, expecting to see their friend behind them at any moment. They kept looking back whenever visibility allowed, scanning the slopes above for any sign of Mick's distinctive clothing or his figure moving down toward them. But he never appeared. The weather continued to worsen dramatically and rapidly. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, as thick clouds and blowing snow created complete whiteout conditions. Later that afternoon, somewhere during their continued descent, Doug and Dougal thought they heard someone calling out through the storm. It was faint and distorted by the howling wind, but it sounded like a voice shouting for help or trying to locate someone. They convinced themselves it might have been Mick, that perhaps he was lost in the whiteout and trying to find the descent route or locate his teammates. But the wind was howling so loudly, creating such a cacophony of sound, that they couldn't be absolutely certain what they were hearing. It could have been Mick. It could have been the wind playing tricks. It could have been their imagination fueled by worry. They shouted back as loudly as they could, straining their voices to be heard over the storm. They listened desperately for a response, for any indication that someone had heard them. But there was nothing they could detect. Or if there was something, if Mick was shouting back, the wind swallowed his voice completely before it could reach them. The storm intensified further, becoming truly dangerous. They had no choice but to continue descending to save themselves. Staying any longer at that altitude in those conditions meant certain death from exposure. They would freeze solid within hours. Mick Burke was never seen again by anyone. His body was never found despite searches. No equipment belonging to him was ever recovered. He simply vanished, as if the mountain had opened up and swallowed him. What happened to him? Did he actually reach the summit and get his footage, only to lose his way in the storm during descent and wander off route into a fatal fall? Did he fall through a cornice, one of those unstable overhanging lips of snow that form along ridges and can collapse without warning, sending climbers plummeting down the face? Or did he simply sit down somewhere, overwhelmed by exhaustion and disorientation from altitude and cold, and let himself freeze to death? Search efforts in the days following his disappearance found absolutely nothing. No body, no camera, no pack, no clues. The mountain had swallowed Mick Burke as completely as it had swallowed so many others before and since. In subsequent years, some climbers reported seeing what they thought might be a body high on the southwest face, a dark shape against the snow that looked vaguely human, but nothing was ever confirmed. The sightings were always distant and unclear, and the mountain is covered with rocks and ice formations that can look disturbingly human-shaped from far away, especially when seen through exhaustion and thin air. Mick Burke's disappearance added another haunting chapter to Everest's growing collection of unsolved mysteries. He had been so heartbreakingly close to his goal, close enough that he could probably see the summit pyramid clearly through breaks in the clouds. But Everest doesn't care about how close anyone is to their dreams. It doesn't recognize courage or determination or ambition. It simply takes what it wants when it wants and offers nothing back in return. The mountain is utterly indifferent to human desires and plans. These four men, Peter Boardman, Joe Tasker, Marco Siffredi, and Mick Burke, all disappeared while chasing dreams that mattered more to them than safety or comfort or even survival itself. They were among the absolute best at what they did, masters of their crafts with years of experience and proven ability. Yet the mountain took them anyway, indifferent to their skills and achievements. What happened to them in those final moments? We may never know with certainty, and perhaps that's somehow fitting for mysteries that occurred in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. Their legacies endure, though, inspiring new generations who look at impossible challenges and see opportunity rather than barriers. They showed us what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept limits and push into territory that terrifies everyone else. Somewhere high on Everest, in the frozen wasteland of the death zone, part of each of them still remains, suspended in time where they made their final stands against a mountain that never loses.